How could a son feel so confident as he took what was never his to sell? Tomorrow, while he celebrates his wedding and dreams of Bali, he'll discover that the apartment, the car, and even his future are built on a single detail he never understood. I stayed silent, but I knew. One fact would unravel everything before his plane ever left the ground. The sharp tear of packing tape being pulled from its roll echoed through my apartment, jarring and relentless. I stood in my own doorway, keys still in hand, watching 3 men in blue uniforms catalog my belongings. They moved with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this countless times before, pressing numbered stickers onto furniture that had been in my family for decades. Dad, perfect timing. My son Evan appeared from the kitchen, clipboard in hand, wearing that particular smile he'd perfected in his finance career, the one that said he was about to explain why something terrible was actually wonderful. The movers are almost done cataloging everything. I set my keys on the small table by the door, the same table where my late wife Helena used to leave her reading glasses. Cataloging for what exactly? Well, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Evan's fiancée Clara emerged from the hallway, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors Helena and I had refinished ourselves 30 years ago. She carried herself with the practiced poise of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. We have some exciting news. I waited. In my 62 years, I'd learned that when people preface news as exciting, it rarely was, at least not for everyone involved. Evan straightened his shoulders. I'm getting married tomorrow, and in a week we're flying to Bali for our honeymoon. His grin widened. I sold your apartment and the collector car from your garage. The words hung in the air like smoke from an electrical fire, acrid and warning of worse to come. I stayed silent, watching my son's face for any sign that this was an elaborate joke. There was none. The apartment sale closes Monday, Clara added, her voice bright with false cheer. And the car went to a collector named Victor Caldwell this afternoon. The money will cover the wedding, the honeymoon, and a down payment on our new place in the financial district. I see. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. And my opinion on this matter? Evan's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his confidence. Dad, come on. You've been talking about downsizing for years, and that car just sits in the garage collecting dust. When's the last time you even drove it? That's not really the point, is it? Look, Clara stepped forward, her hand finding Evan's arm in a gesture that looked supportive but felt territorial. We know this is a big change, but honestly, Julian, you need to start letting go of the past. Helena's been gone for 3 years, it's time to move forward. The casual use of my late wife's name, spoken with such dismissive certainty, hit harder than the news about my possessions. Helena Torres Mercer had been the gravitational center of our family. Without her, we'd all been spinning in increasingly distant orbits. My phone buzzed. A text from Mina Castellano, our family lawyer and one of Helena's oldest friends. Let's talk soon. Urgent. Where exactly am I supposed to live while you're honeymooning in Bali? I asked. We've looked into some really nice senior communities, Evan said quickly. There's one called Golden Years that has a waiting list, but with your engineering background, they'd probably... I'm 62, not 82. Dad, you're being dramatic. This is good for everyone. You get a fresh start, we get to begin our marriage without worrying about managing your affairs. Managing my affairs. As if I were already incompetent, already a burden to be shuffled aside. I looked around the apartment where Helena and I had hosted Christmas dinners, birthday parties, anniversary celebrations, where we'd argued about paint colors and celebrated promotions and held each other through her final illness. We're having dinner at Meridian tonight, Clara said. 7 o'clock. We want to share the news with the rest of the family properly. The news about the wedding, you mean? All of it, Evan said firmly. This is a celebration, Dad. Try to see it that way. After they left, I stood in my living room, former living room, listening to the movers work. They were efficient and polite, treating my life's accumulation with the same careful indifference they'd show anyone's belongings. Just objects to be cataloged, moved, and redistributed. I walked to the window overlooking the small garden where Helena had grown tomatoes and basil. The new owners would probably pave it over for parking. Everything changes, she used to say. The trick is deciding what changes you and what you change. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Finn Nakamura, my old friend who restored classic cars. Heard about the Roadster. Call me. I didn't call him back yet. Instead, I went down to the garage, using my key to open the bay where my 1967 custom Roadster sat under its protective cover. The car wasn't just a collector's item, it was the culmination of 5 years of meticulous work, rebuilt from the frame up using techniques I'd developed during my 30-year career as a mechanical engineer. But that wasn't why it was in my collection. And that wasn't the detail that would collapse everything before Evan's plane ever took off. I pulled the cover back and ran my hand along the pristine red paint. Hidden beneath the hood, invisible to casual inspection, was a prototype engine component I'd designed and patented. A component that was still under federal export restrictions. A component that made the car legally impossible to sell without specific government clearances. Evan didn't know about the patents. He didn't know about the restrictions. He didn't know that his buyer would discover the truth the moment he tried to register the vehicle. And he certainly didn't know that the apartment sale was invalid, because I'd never actually signed the transfer documents. I stayed silent, but I knew. One fact would unravel everything before his plane ever left the ground. Meridian was the kind of restaurant where the waitstaff spoke in hushed tones and the wine list required a small loan. Clara had chosen it, of course. Everything about the evening was designed to project success, from the crisp white tablecloths to the soft jazz playing just loud enough to provide sophistication without interfering with conversation. I arrived precisely at 7, wearing the navy blazer Helena had bought me for our last anniversary. The hostess led me to a round table where Evan's extended social circle was already assembled. Clara's parents, Victoria and Richard Voss, Evan's college roommate Derek Hoffman and his wife Natasha, and my sister-in-law Carmen Torres, Helena's younger sister who'd always viewed me with polite skepticism. Julian. Victoria Voss rose to greet me with air kisses that didn't quite make contact. How wonderful that you could join us for this celebration. I took the empty seat between Carmen and Derek, noting that it was positioned with my back to the restaurant's main dining room. A subtle but effective way to minimize my presence in what was clearly meant to be Evan and Clara's show. "We were just talking about the wedding tomorrow," Carmen said, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced enthusiasm that family members use when they're trying to smooth over awkwardness. "It's going to be beautiful." "I'm sure it will be." I unfolded my napkin and placed it in my lap, a gesture that felt oddly formal given that these people had just redistributed my life without consulting me. Evan and Clara arrived 20 minutes later, making an entrance that suggested they'd been waiting outside for maximum impact. Clara wore a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and Evan had the confident swagger of a man who believed the world was arranging itself for his convenience. "Sorry we're late," Clara announced, though she didn't sound particularly sorry. "Last-minute wedding details, you know how it is." The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Discussion of flower arrangements and seating charts, speculation about tomorrow's weather, compliments on Clara's dress and Evan's recent promotion. I participated minimally, offering the occasional nod or brief comment when directly addressed. It wasn't until the main courses arrived that Evan stood up, wine glass in hand. "I wanted to gather everyone here tonight because Clara and I have some exciting news to share." He paused for effect, his media-trained smile sweeping the table. "Obviously, we're getting married tomorrow, which is incredible enough. But we've also made some important family decisions that are going to set us up for an amazing future." I felt Carmen's hand briefly touch my arm, a gesture of either support or warning. "As you all know, Dad's been living in the same apartment for decades. It's a beautiful place, full of memories. But honestly, it's way too big for one person, so we've arranged for him to transition to something more manageable." "How thoughtful," Victoria murmured, though her tone suggested she was already calculating the financial implications. "We've also helped him liquidate some assets that weren't really being used," Clara added. "Julian had this gorgeous vintage car that was just sitting in storage. We found a collector who absolutely loves it, and the sale is going to help fund our honeymoon." Derek raised his glass. "To new beginnings and smart financial planning." The table erupted in polite applause and murmurs of approval. I noticed that no one asked for my perspective on these smart decisions. No one inquired whether I'd been consulted or whether I was comfortable with the arrangements. "Julian?" Richard Voss leaned forward, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of a man who'd built his wealth by convincing people to make decisions that benefited him more than them. "I think it's wonderful that you're embracing this transition. Too many people your age cling to possessions and properties that just become burdens." "My age," I repeated quietly. "Well, you know what I mean. The freedom years. Time to travel, explore new interests, maybe take up painting or learn a language." "I already speak 3 languages," I said, "and I've been to 47 countries." An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Carmen cleared her throat. "Julian's always been very accomplished. Helena used to joke that she married a Renaissance man." "Of course," Clara said quickly. "We didn't mean to imply otherwise. It's just that sometimes people need a little help seeing new possibilities." "Oh, people," I said. "You mean old people." Evan's jaw tightened. "Dad, you're being sensitive. We're trying to do something nice here." By selling my home and my car without asking my permission? The table went completely quiet. Even the ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade as our small drama played out in real time. "We talked about this," Evan said, his voice dropping to what I recognized as his professional negotiation tone. "You've been saying for years that the apartment is too big. And the car? When's the last time you even started the engine?" 2 weeks ago, I said truthfully. "I drive it every other Sunday to keep the battery charged and the seals lubricated." "Okay, but realistically, how often do you actually take it anywhere?" "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Clara's voice carried a sharp edge now, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you're more attached to objects than you are to your son's happiness." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Around the table, faces showed varying degrees of discomfort, curiosity, and judgment. This was the moment where I was supposed to back down, apologize for being difficult, and graciously accept their decisions for my own good. Instead, I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. "The point," I said finally, "is that some things have value beyond what appears on the surface. Some things have history, significance, legal complications that aren't immediately obvious to people who don't understand their full context." "Legal complications?" Derek looked confused. "It's a car, not a nuclear reactor." I smiled at that. If only he knew how close to the truth he'd stumbled. My phone buzzed with another message from Mina. "Call me tonight. Important." "You know what?" Evan set his wine glass down harder than necessary. "This is exactly why we made these decisions without getting you involved in every detail. You overthink everything. You find problems where none exist. Sometimes you just have to trust that other people might know what's best." "Other people," I repeated. "You mean younger people?" "I mean people who are thinking clearly about the future instead of clinging to the past." Carmen shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should talk about something else. The wedding tomorrow, perhaps." But Clara wasn't ready to let it go. "Julian, I understand this is hard. Change is always difficult, especially when you've been set in your ways for so long. But Evan and I are trying to build a life together, and that means making some tough decisions about family resources and priorities." Family resources. As if my apartment and my car had somehow become shared property the moment Helena was gone. "I see," I said. "And where exactly am I supposed to live while you're building this life in Bali?" "We've researched several excellent senior living communities," Evan said. "Places where you'd have social activities, meal plans, transportation services. You'd probably be much happier." "Senior living communities. Dad, you're 62. That's not exactly ancient, but it's also not too early to start thinking about practical arrangements." I looked around the table at these people, family, friends, witnesses to this carefully orchestrated redistribution of my life. They were all nodding along, convinced that they were participants in a reasonable adult conversation about responsible planning. None of them had asked what I wanted. None of them had inquired about my preferences, my plans, my feelings about being managed like an incompetent relative. They'd simply decided what was best and expected me to be grateful for their intervention. "Well," I said, standing up and placing my napkin beside my barely touched plate, "this has been illuminating." "Dad, where are you going?" Evan's voice carried a note of panic. "We haven't even had dessert." "I think I've had enough for one evening." I reached for my wallet, but Richard Voss waved me away. "Don't worry about it, Julian. Dinner's on us." Of course it was. Even the bill was being managed for me. "I'll see you all at the wedding tomorrow," I said. "It should be very interesting." As I walked away from the table, I heard Clara's voice, pitched just loud enough for me to catch. "I told you he'd be difficult about this." Outside the restaurant, I finally called Mina back. "Julian, thank God. We need to meet first thing in the morning. There are some serious problems with these property transfers that Evan initiated." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that could land him in legal trouble if they're not resolved quickly." "How much do you know about what he's actually done?" I looked back through the restaurant window at the table where my family was probably already moving on to lighter conversation, secure in their belief that they'd handled a difficult situation with appropriate firmness. "More than he thinks," I said, "but apparently less than I need to." "My office, 8 a.m. And Julian? Don't sign anything else until we talk." I hung up and walked to my car, not the roadster, which was apparently no longer mine, but the practical sedan I used for daily errands. As I drove through the city streets toward the hotel where I'd apparently be spending the night, I thought about Helena's last words to me. "Take care of our family," she'd whispered, "but don't let them take care of you unless you want them to." I'd promised her I would. I just never imagined how hard that promise would be to keep. Mina Castellano's law office occupied the third floor of a converted brownstone in the historic district, the kind of building where the stairs creaked with authority and the walls seemed to absorb decades of whispered confidences. I'd been there many times over the years, for Helena's will, for property transfers, for the mundane legal maintenance that accumulates around a life well lived. This morning felt different. Mina's usually immaculate desk was covered with scattered documents, and her typically composed demeanor showed cracks of barely controlled anger. "Julian, sit down." She gestured to the leather chair across from her desk. "We have a problem. Actually, we have several problems, but they all stem from the same source." I settled into the chair, noting the familiar scent of old books and coffee that always made this office feel like a refuge. "Evan's real estate transaction?" "Among other things." Mina pulled a thick folder from the chaos on her desk. "Let's start with the apartment. Did you sign any transfer documents? Any sales agreements? Anything that would give Evan authority to sell your property?" "No." "You're absolutely certain?" "Mina, I think I'd remember signing away my home." She nodded, but her expression remained grim. "That's what I thought, which means Evan has committed fraud. He's accepted money for property he doesn't own and has no legal right to sell." The words hit like a physical blow. "Fraud?" "The buyer, a couple named Patricia and Kenneth Morrison, gave Evan a certified check for $450,000 yesterday afternoon. They're scheduled to take possession Monday morning. When they discover that the sale is invalid, they're going to want answers, and probably criminal charges." I stared at the documents spread across her desk, trying to process the magnitude of what my son had done. How is this possible? Don't real estate transactions require documentation, verification, legal oversight? They do, which is why I'm trying to understand how Evan managed to circumvent all of those protections. Mina opened the folder and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "He used a private sale arrangement, claimed to be acting as your agent under a power of attorney." "I never gave him power of attorney." "I know, but he presented documents that suggested otherwise. Forged documents, apparently." The room seemed to tilt slightly. My son, had forged legal documents to steal my home. "What about the car?" Mina's expression grew even darker. "That's actually worse. Tell me about the Roadster, Julian. What makes it special?" I'd been dreading this question, but also anticipating it. It's not just a restored classic. The engine contains a prototype component I developed during my last project at Morrison Dynamics. "What kind of component?" "A hybrid fuel injection system that increases efficiency by 37% while reducing emissions by nearly half. It was part of a Defense Department contract for next-generation military vehicles." Mina went very still. "Defense Department." "The patent is classified under the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. The component can't be sold, transferred, or exported without federal clearance, which means Evan just sold restricted military technology to a private collector." Mina's voice was barely above a whisper. "Julian, this isn't just fraud anymore. This is potentially a federal crime." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between us like a third presence in the room. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of a Saturday morning. Traffic, voices, the ordinary bustle of people going about their lives without the knowledge that their world was about to collapse. "There's more," Mina said finally. "I did some research on this Victor Caldwell, the man who bought the car. He's not just a collector, he's a dealer who specializes in high-end exports. Classic American cars for wealthy overseas clients." "Overseas?" "Julian, if that car leaves the country with your prototype still in the engine, we're looking at violations of the Arms Export Control Act. Evan could face 20 years in federal prison." I thought about my son's confident smile last night, his casual dismissal of my concerns, his absolute certainty that he understood the situation better than I did. He'd been so focused on the surface value of things, the apartment's market price, the car's collector appeal, that he'd never bothered to look deeper. "What can we do?" "For the apartment, we can contact the buyers immediately, explain the situation, and return their money. They'll be angry, but if we handle it correctly, they might not press charges." "And the car?" Mina hesitated. "That's more complicated. If Caldwell still has it, we might be able to unwind the sale quietly. But if he's already moved it, or if he started the export process, then we call the authorities." "Julian, if we involve federal law enforcement, Evan will be arrested. There's no getting around that. The government takes ITAR violations very seriously." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the small garden behind the building. Helena had always loved this view, the way the morning light filtered through the oak leaves, the sense of peace in the middle of the city's chaos. She'd often said that some problems solve themselves if you just waited long enough, but others required decisive action. "What would you do?" I asked. "If it were your son?" "I'd try to fix it quietly first. But Julian, you need to understand. Evan has put himself in an impossible position. Even if we can resolve the legal issues, the trust between you two was already broken." I turned back to face her. "This didn't start yesterday, Mina. This has been building for months. Ever since Helena passed away, Evan's been treating me like an incompetent old man who needs to be managed for his own good. And now? Now I'm going to remind him that I'm not incompetent, and I'm definitely not powerless." Mina nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Contact the apartment buyers, explain the situation, and arrange to return their money. Then find out exactly where that car is and whether it's moved since yesterday." "And Evan?" I looked at my watch. In 6 hours, my son would be getting married in front of 200 guests, including most of our extended family and all of his professional colleagues. He'd be standing at the altar, confident in his success, secure in his belief that he'd solved all of his financial problems through clever resource management. He had no idea that his new father-in-law was currently in his hotel room, frantically trying to reach him about irregularities in the property documentation. He had no idea that Victor Caldwell had spent the morning on the phone with federal regulators, trying to understand why his new acquisition was flagged in the export control database. And he certainly had no idea that his father, the man he'd dismissed as clinging to the past, was about to demonstrate the difference between quiet competence and loud arrogance. "Let me worry about Evan," I said. The Grandview Hotel's business center was nearly empty at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, just me and a traveling salesman who was frantically trying to print boarding passes for a flight that had probably already left. I'd claimed a corner workstation and spread out the documents Mina had given me, along with my own files from the storage unit where I'd kept my engineering records. The storage unit that Evan didn't know about, the records he'd never bothered to ask about, the evidence of a 30-year career that he'd reduced to, "Dad used to fix things." My phone rang. Finn Nakamura's name appeared on the screen. "Julian, I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. What the hell is going on with the Roadster?" "It's complicated, Finn. Where are you?" "In my shop, staring at a very confused rich guy who says he bought your car but can't figure out why the registration is being held up by Homeland Security." I closed my eyes. "Victor Caldwell is there?" "In the flesh, and getting more agitated by the minute. He keeps talking about a buyer in Monaco who's expecting delivery next week." "Monaco. Of course. Finn, listen to me very carefully. Do not let that car leave your shop. Do not let Caldwell take it anywhere. If necessary, disable it." "Julian, I'm serious. There are federal law enforcement implications here that could send people to prison. Just keep the car where it is until you hear from me again." I hung up and immediately called Mina. "The car's at Finn's restoration shop," I told her. "Caldwell is trying to export it to Monaco, but the registration is being blocked." "Thank God for small favors. I'll contact the relevant agencies and make sure it stays blocked. But Julian, this is escalating quickly. Caldwell is going to start asking questions, and when he does, those questions are going to lead straight back to Evan. How long do we have? Hours, maybe less? Federal investigators don't work bankers' hours when ITAR violations are involved." I looked at my watch again. The wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock. The reception would run until midnight, followed by an early morning flight to Los Angeles and then on to Bali. Evan's entire timeline depended on nothing going wrong in the next 18 hours. "Mina, I need you to do something that might sound strange. At this point, nothing sounds strange. I want you to attend the wedding." Silence. Then, "Julian, I'm not sure that's appropriate. Given the circumstances, I need a witness, someone who understands the legal implications of what's happening, someone who can document what occurs." "What exactly do you think is going to occur?" I gathered the documents and slid them back into their folders. "I'm going to give my son one last chance to do the right thing, and when he doesn't take it, I'm going to make sure everyone understands the consequences of treating family like assets to be liquidated." The wedding venue was a sprawling estate in the hills outside the city, the kind of place that charged by the square foot for elegance. I'd been there once before, for a charity fundraiser Helena had insisted we attend. She'd spent the evening quietly critiquing the ostentatious displays of wealth, while I calculated the engineering requirements for the mansion's impossible cantilever balconies. Today, the grounds were transformed into a fairy tale wedding set, complete with white silk draping, thousands of flowers, and enough ambient lighting to power a small city. Guests were already arriving, parking their luxury cars in neat rows and making their way toward the cocktail reception that would precede the ceremony. I recognized most of the faces: family members, college friends, professional colleagues, social acquaintances who'd been cultivated for their networking value. The kind of people who'd nod sympathetically when Evan explained how difficult it had been to manage his aging father's affairs, who'd compliment him on his mature handling of a delicate family situation. Carmen Torres spotted me first. "Julian, you look wonderful. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Carmen. How are you enjoying the festivities?" "It's beautiful, isn't it? Clara's parents really outdid themselves." She lowered her voice. "I have to ask, are you okay with all the changes? The apartment, the car? It seems like a lot to handle all at once." "It's certainly been educational." Before she could ask what I meant, Derek Hoffman appeared at my elbow. "Julian, good to see you. Hey, I wanted to apologize if things got a little intense last night at dinner. Family discussions can get complicated, you know?" "They certainly can." "But I think what Evan and Clara are doing is really smart. Getting ahead of these kinds of transitions before they become problems. My parents went through something similar a few years ago." "Did they?" "Oh yeah. Dad was holding on to this old workshop, hadn't used it in years, but he couldn't bring himself to let it go. Finally, my brother and I just handled it for him. Found a buyer, cleaned everything out, got Dad set up in a nice condo closer to medical facilities. He was upset at first, but now he admits it was the right move." I nodded politely. "And your father's workshop? What kind of work did he do there?" "Oh, just hobby stuff. Woodworking, model trains. Nothing important?" "Nothing important." I wondered if Derek's father had felt the same way about his life's passion being dismissed so casually. "Julian!" Victoria Voss materialized beside us, resplendent in a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "How lovely to see you. Are you excited about the ceremony?" "Very much so." "And how are you feeling about everything else? The big changes?" "Which changes specifically?" She looked momentarily confused, as if the question hadn't occurred to her. "Well, you know. The new living arrangements, the simplified lifestyle. It must be liberating in a way." "Liberating?" "To be free of all those responsibilities, all that maintenance and upkeep. I keep telling Richard we should do the same thing. Just get rid of everything we don't absolutely need and focus on experiences instead of possessions." I glanced around the lavish wedding venue with its imported flowers and custom lighting and catered elegance. Interesting philosophy. "Oh, but this is different. This is an investment in Evan and Clara's future, starting their marriage with a solid financial foundation, without the burden of managing elderly parents' estates." Elderly parents' estates. As if I were already gone and they were simply speeding up the inheritance process. My phone buzzed with a text from Mina. "In position. Ready when you are." I looked across the lawn toward the ceremony site, where Evan was standing with the wedding party, adjusting his tie and laughing at something the best man had whispered. He looked confident, successful, completely in control of his world. In 90 minutes, he'd be married. In 8 hours, he'd be on a plane to Bali, funded by money that wasn't legally his, celebrating a future built on fraud and federal crimes he didn't even know he'd committed. Unless I stopped him. "Excuse me," I said to Victoria. "I need to speak with the groom." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn as guests took their seats for the ceremony. I found myself in the third row, positioned where I could see both the altar and the majority of the assembled crowd. 200 people, all dressed in their finest, all here to witness what they believed would be a perfect beginning to a perfect marriage. Mina had positioned herself near the back, close to the aisle, with a clear view of the proceedings and quick access to the exit if needed. We'd agreed on a simple signal system. If things went according to plan, I'd proceed with what we'd discussed. If they didn't, she'd intervene before the situation escalated beyond our control. The string quartet began the processional, and the wedding party made their way down the aisle with practiced precision. Clara's bridesmaids floated past in coordinated silk, followed by Clara herself, radiant in a dress that had probably required its own zip code for shipping. She moved with the confident grace of someone who'd never doubted that this moment would arrive exactly as she'd planned it. Evan waited at the altar, beaming with the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully arranged all the pieces of his life into their proper positions. He'd solved his financial problems, secured his future, and managed his family's assets with what he believed was admirable efficiency. In his mind, he was the protagonist of a success story that would only get better from here. The officiant began with the traditional words about gathering together to witness the union of 2 lives, 2 families, 2 futures. I listened with half my attention while mentally reviewing the documents in my jacket pocket and the timeline Mina and I had constructed. At this very moment, Victor Caldwell was probably still at Finn's shop, growing increasingly frustrated with the bureaucratic delays surrounding his new acquisition. The Morrison couple who'd bought my apartment were likely enjoying a celebratory lunch, blissfully unaware that their dream home purchase was about to become a legal nightmare. And somewhere in a federal office building, investigators were beginning to trace the chain of ownership on a restricted military prototype that should never have been offered for sale. If anyone has reason why this couple should not be joined in marriage, the officiant intoned, speak now or forever, hold your peace. The traditional pause followed, that moment of dramatic silence that everyone expects but no one ever fills. Except this time, I stood up. I do, I said clearly. The reaction was immediate and electric. 200 heads turned toward me in perfect synchronization, like a flock of birds responding to a predator's shadow. The string quartet faltered and stopped. Evan's face went through a rapid succession of emotions, confusion, embarrassment, anger, before settling on something that looked like panic. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent lawn. "What are you doing?" I stepped into the aisle, my movements deliberate and unhurried. I'm exercising my right to speak, as the father of the groom, and as the victim of multiple felonies that have been committed to fund this celebration. The word felonies rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. I could hear whispered conversations starting, see people pulling out their phones, feel the collective shift from wedding joy to scandalized fascination. Clara's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Julian, this is neither the time nor the place. Actually, this is exactly the time and place." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the first folder. Because in approximately 6 hours, you and my son plan to board a plane to Bali using money obtained through fraud, identity theft, and violations of federal arms trafficking laws. Evan stepped forward, his hands raised in what he probably thought was a calming gesture. "Dad, you're having some kind of episode. Maybe we should—" "I'm not having an episode, Evan. I'm having a revelation. About what happens when you assume that quiet people are powerless people. About what happens when you mistake respect for weakness." I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting this lovely ceremony, but I think you should know what you're really celebrating here. Yesterday, my son sold my apartment to a lovely couple named Patricia and Kenneth Morrison for $450,000. Murmurs of confusion from the crowd. Real estate transactions weren't typically considered scandalous. The problem is, I never gave him permission to sell my apartment. In fact, I never signed any documents transferring ownership to him, which means he committed fraud, accepted money for property he didn't own, and forged legal documents to complete the transaction. The murmurs grew louder. I could see Victoria and Richard Voss exchanging alarmed glances, probably calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from this disaster. "But that's just the beginning," I continued. "He also sold my 1967 custom roadster to a collector named Victor Caldwell. Beautiful car, worth about $200,000 to the right buyer. Unfortunately, the engine contains a prototype component I developed under a classified Defense Department contract." Complete silence now. Even the birds seem to have stopped singing. "The component is protected under the International Traffic in Arms regulations. It cannot be sold, transferred, or exported without federal clearance, which means my son just sold restricted military technology to a private dealer who specializes in overseas exports." Evan's face had gone from pale to gray. "Dad, that's impossible. It's just a car engine." "It's a hybrid fuel injection system that increases efficiency by 37% while reducing emissions by nearly half. Patent number 10,847-93, classified under ITR category A8A. The penalty for unauthorized transfer is up to 20 years in federal prison." I pulled out my phone and showed the screen to the crowd. "I have 3 missed calls from Homeland Security, 2 from the Department of Defense, and 1 from the FBI. They're all very interested in speaking with the person who arranged the sale of my car." The silence stretched like a taut wire. Then Clara's voice, barely above a whisper. "This is insane. You're sabotaging your own son's wedding over some paperwork confusion." "This isn't a paperwork confusion, Clara. This is felony fraud and federal weapons trafficking. The buyer is currently at my friend's restoration shop, trying to understand why his export license has been revoked and why federal agents are asking questions about his business practices." I looked directly at Evan. "You wanted to manage my affairs because you thought I was too old and too confused to handle my own life. You sold my home and my possessions because you decided they weren't important to anyone who mattered. You treated me like an incompetent elderly relative who should be grateful for your intervention." My voice remained calm, conversational, as if I were discussing the weather rather than destroying my son's life in front of 200 witnesses. "But you never bothered to ask what those possessions actually were. You never investigated their legal status. You never considered that a man who spent 30 years as a defense contractor might have accumulated assets that were more complicated than they appeared." Evan tried one more time. "Dad, please. We can work this out. Whatever mistakes were made, we can fix them. Can we fix the Morrison family's trust when they discover their dream home purchase was fraudulent? Can we fix Victor Caldwell's reputation when federal investigators seize his business records? Can we fix the fact that you forged legal documents and trafficked in restricted military technology? I pulled out the final folder and held it up for everyone to see. Now, this contains the original patent documentation for my prototype engine, the federal contracts that govern its use, and the legal opinions that Mina Castellano prepared this morning about your liability under various criminal statutes. I handed the folder to the efficient, who accepted it with the bewildered expression of a man whose job description had never included handling federal crime evidence. Evan, you have exactly one chance to do the right thing. You can contact the Morrison family immediately, return their money, and apologize for the fraud. You can call Victor Caldwell and arrange to return the car before federal agents seize it as evidence, and you can hope that voluntary cooperation might reduce your eventual prison sentence. The crowd was completely silent now, transfixed by the spectacle of a family destroying itself in real time. I could see people recording with their phones, undoubtedly already uploading to social media. By tonight, this would be viral. By tomorrow, it would be a cautionary tale about family dynamics and criminal stupidity. Or, I continued, you can proceed with this wedding, board your plane to Bali, and discover that international travel becomes very difficult when you're the subject of federal arrest warrants. Evan looked around desperately, as if hoping someone in the crowd might offer him a way out of this nightmare. But the faces staring back at him showed only shock, fascination, and the particular kind of social horror that comes from witnessing someone else's complete humiliation. Clara grabbed his arm. Evan, we need to leave. Now. We can figure this out later, but we need to get away from here. I shook my head. Clara, leaving now would be the worst possible decision. It would look like consciousness of guilt, and it would guarantee that federal agents treat this as a flight risk situation. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was Washington, D.C. Excuse me, I said to the crowd. I should probably take this. I answered the call on speakerphone. Mr. Julian Mercer, this is Special Agent Patricia Hendricks with the Department of Homeland Security. We need to speak with you immediately about the unauthorized transfer of restricted technology. Are you available for an interview? The words echoed across the silent wedding venue with the finality of an irreversible verdict. I'm available, I said, and I believe my son Evan would like to voluntarily cooperate with your investigation. I looked at Evan one final time. The choice is yours, son, federal prison or federal cooperation. But either way, your plane to Bali isn't leaving tomorrow morning. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Clara's bouquet hitting the ground as she turned and ran toward the parking lot, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a flag of surrender. The aftermath of a destroyed wedding moves with its own peculiar rhythm. First comes the stunned silence, then the whispered conversations, then the awkward exodus as guests realize they're witnessing something that belongs in a courtroom rather than a celebration. I remained standing in the aisle, still holding my phone, as 200 people processed what they'd just heard. Special Agent Hendricks was still on the line, asking questions about my location and requesting that I remain available for immediate interview. In the background, I could hear other voices, federal agents coordinating a response to what had suddenly become a multi-jurisdictional investigation. Evan stood frozen at the altar, his face cycling through expressions like a man trying to solve an equation that kept changing its variables. The confident groom of 10 minutes ago had been replaced by someone who looked like he was calculating prison sentences and trying to remember whether Bali had an extradition treaty with the United States. Agent Hendricks, I said into the phone, I'm currently at a wedding venue in the hills outside the city. The person who arranged the unauthorized transfer is here with me, along with approximately 200 witnesses. Would you like me to secure the location? Sir, we need you to maintain your current position and ensure that no one leaves until our agents arrive. We have units en route. The magic words that transform a social gathering into a crime scene. Around me, I could see guests beginning to understand that they weren't just witnesses anymore. They were potential evidence in a federal investigation. Derek Hoffman was the first to break the spell. Julian, this is insane. You're destroying your son's life over some bureaucratic misunderstanding. Derek, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is fraud and arms trafficking. The federal government takes these crimes very seriously, even when they're committed by people in expensive suits. Victoria Voss had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Richard, we need to leave. Now. I'm not getting involved in this family drama. Ma'am, I called out, Agent Hendricks has requested that everyone remain here until federal investigators arrive. Leaving now could be construed as obstruction of justice. The crowd rippled with nervous energy. These were people accustomed to controlling their environments, to managing their exposure to unpleasant realities. Finding themselves trapped at a crime scene was not part of their social repertoire. Carmen Torres approached me cautiously, as if I might detonate if startled. "Julian, what are you doing? This is your son's wedding day." "This is my son's reckoning day. There's a difference." "But the family, the humiliation..." "Carmen, the humiliation started when Evan decided to treat me like an incompetent old man whose possessions could be liquidated for his convenience. This is just the consequence of that decision." Mina appeared at my side, having moved up from her position in the back. "Julian, Agent Hendricks wants to speak with me about the legal documentation. Should I?" "Tell her everything. Full cooperation." Evan finally found his voice. "Dad, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this privately. We don't need to involve federal agents and destroy everyone's lives." I looked at my son, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in months. He was 32 years old, successful in his career, intelligent enough to navigate complex financial markets. But standing there in his wedding tuxedo, pleading for mercy from the father he'd been managing like a senile dependent, he looked like a child who'd been caught stealing and couldn't understand why the consequences were so severe. "Evan, you didn't make mistakes. You committed crimes. Multiple felonies that carry decades in prison. The time for private family solutions ended when you forged my signature and sold restricted military technology." "I didn't know about the military stuff." "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You assume that because I'm 62 and widowed, I must be too confused to understand my own possessions. You decided that your financial needs were more important than my legal rights." The sound of approaching helicopters began to echo across the hills. Federal agents apparently don't mess around when ITAR violations are involved. "And now," I continued, "you're going to learn the difference between managing someone and respecting them, between taking what you want and earning what you get." Clara reappeared at the edge of the venue, having apparently abandoned her escape attempt when she realized there was nowhere to run. Her wedding dress was torn and dirty, her makeup streaked with tears, her carefully orchestrated fairy tale transformed into a very public nightmare. "This is all your fault," she screamed at me across the lawn. "You're a bitter old man who can't stand to see his son succeed." "Clara, my son's success was never the issue. His methods were the problem. We were trying to help you. We were trying to make sure you were taken care of. You were trying to liquidate my assets to fund your honeymoon. There's a difference." The helicopters were closer now, and I could see the first federal vehicles winding up the access road toward the venue. The guests were beginning to panic, pulling out phones to call lawyers and spouses and anyone who might help them navigate this unprecedented social disaster. Finn Nakamura's voice came through my phone. Apparently, he'd been listening to the entire conversation through an open line. "Julian, the feds are here at my shop, too. They've seized the car and arrested Caldwell. He's screaming about being set up, demanding to know why no one told him about the military restrictions." "Because the person who sold it to him didn't know about the restrictions," I replied, "and didn't bother to find out." Evan's legs seemed to give out. He sat down heavily in one of the white chairs that had been arranged for the ceremony, his head in his hands. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Evan, intentions don't matter when you're dealing with federal crimes. The government doesn't care that you were trying to fund a nice honeymoon. They care that you trafficked in restricted weapons technology." The first federal agents appeared at the venue entrance, serious people in dark suits, who moved with the purposeful efficiency of professionals handling a national security incident. They surveyed the scene with a calm assessment of people who'd seen every possible variation of human stupidity. Special Agent Hendricks was a woman in her 40s, with the kind of presence that made everyone else seem smaller and less significant. She approached me directly, ignoring the crowd of overdressed wedding guests who were trying to blend into the background. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Agent Hendricks. We need to discuss the timeline of events leading to the unauthorized transfer." "Of course. I have documentation prepared, and my attorney is here to assist." She looked around at the wedding venue, taking in the abandoned altar, the scattered flowers, the crowd of witnesses who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. "This is certainly a first," she said dryly. "Usually we don't get called to investigate arms trafficking at social events." "My son has a flair for the dramatic. And you, Mr. Mercer, do you also have a flair for the dramatic?" I considered the question. "Agent Hendricks, I'm a retired engineer who spent 30 years working on classified defense projects. I understand the importance of following proper procedures and respecting legal boundaries. When those boundaries are violated, even by family members, the consequences need to be proportional to the severity of the violations." She nodded slowly. "And you believe public humiliation is proportional to federal crimes?" I believe that people who commit crimes while treating their victims as irrelevant deserve to face the consequences in front of the community that enabled their behavior. Agent Hendricks looked at Evan, who was still sitting in his chair, staring at his hands. Mr. Evan Mercer, we need to speak with you about your role in these transactions. Evan looked up, his face streaked with tears. I want to cooperate. I want to fix this. I never meant to hurt anyone. Sir, I need to inform you that you're under investigation for multiple federal crimes. You have the right to remain silent and to have an attorney present during questioning. The Miranda warning, delivered in a wedding venue, with 200 witnesses recording every word. By tomorrow, this would be the most famous wedding disaster in social media history. As the agents began to process the scene and separate witnesses for individual interviews, I found myself standing alone near the altar where my son should have been married. The late afternoon sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the abandoned celebration. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Mercer, this is Patricia Morrison. We need to discuss the apartment situation urgently. Our attorney says we may have grounds for criminal charges. I looked at the message, then at my son being led away for federal questioning, then at the crowd of family and friends who were learning that their comfortable assumptions about wealth and privilege didn't protect them from the consequences of actual crimes. Helena had been right, as usual. Some problems solved themselves if you just waited long enough, but others required decisive action. I'd taken decisive action. Now we'd all live with the consequences. The plane to Bali would be leaving without them tomorrow morning. But then again, international travel becomes complicated when you're the subject of federal arrest warrants. Some details, it turns out, really can collapse everything before the plane ever takes off. The federal courthouse in downtown had the kind of imposing architecture designed to remind people that justice was serious business. I sat in the gallery, watching as Evan stood before the judge for his sentencing hearing. He'd pled guilty to fraud and ITR violations 3 months ago, part of a cooperation agreement that had helped federal agents uncover a larger network of illegal arms technology transfers. Clara had left him 2 weeks after the wedding. The marriage had never been legally finalized, which saved them both the trouble of divorce proceedings. She'd moved back to her parents' house and was reportedly seeing a plastic surgeon who specialized in discretion and wealthy clients who preferred to avoid public scandals. Mr. Evan Mercer, the judge intoned, you have pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud and violations of the international traffic in arms regulations. While I appreciate your cooperation with federal investigators, these are serious crimes that strike at the heart of our national security. Evan stood straight, wearing a simple gray suit instead of his usual designer attire. Prison had a way of simplifying one's wardrobe choices. The court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and community service. You will also pay full restitution to the victims of your fraud. 18 months. It could have been 20 years if he hadn't cooperated. The prosecutor had been surprisingly lenient, given the severity of the charges. After the hearing, Evan and I stood together in the courthouse hallway for the first time since the wedding. He looked older, humbled by the experience of learning that actions have consequences regardless of your intentions. Dad, he said quietly, I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand now. What I did to you, what I assumed about you. It was wrong. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus the practiced contrition of someone who'd learned to say the right words. Evan, forgiveness isn't really the issue. Understanding is what matters. Do you understand why I stopped you the way I did? Because I committed crimes. No, because you treated me like I was already gone. You liquidated my life as if my opinions, my rights, my dignity were irrelevant. The crimes were just the method. The disrespect was the real problem. He nodded slowly. I thought I was helping. I thought I was being responsible. You thought you were being convenient. There's a difference. We walked toward the courthouse exit together, past the metal detectors and security guards and all the apparatus of a justice system that had suddenly become very relevant to our family. What happens now? Evan asked. Now you serve your sentence and learn to rebuild your life without assuming that other people exist for your convenience. And I go back to living in my apartment, driving my car, and making my own decisions about my own possessions. The apartment, the Morrisons, were very understanding once they learned the full circumstances. Mina helped negotiate a settlement that covered their expenses and inconvenience. They're actually buying a different property now, one with a more transparent ownership history. And the car? Is back in my garage where it belongs. Finn helped me install additional security features to prevent any future unauthorized transfers. We reached the courthouse steps, where the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the plaza. In a few hours, Evan would report to federal prison to begin his sentence. In a few months, he'd start the long process of rebuilding his reputation and his relationships. "Dad," he said as we prepared to part ways, "when I get out, when this is over, do you think we could try again? As father and son, I mean, without all the assumptions and management and disrespect." I looked at my son, this man who'd tried to liquidate my life for his convenience and ended up destroying his own future in the process. He was still my child, still the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework and worried about during his teenage years. "Evan, that depends entirely on whether you've learned the difference between helping someone and controlling them, between respecting your elders and managing them like assets." "I think I'm starting to understand." "Good. Because I'm 62, not 92. I'm widowed, not incompetent. And I'm your father, not your client."